I started playing Final Fantasy XIV about a month and a half ago, and I'm approaching 7 days on slash playtime. So I figured I'd take some time to look back at the good and bad things about the game so far and just sort of give my opinions on it. I want to start with a few disclaimers. First of all, this is going to be mostly off the cuff. I'm just kind of going down a list of bullet points about the game and just kind of talking about things that I had noted down. It's not going to be like a script or anything, and I'm not going to do a bunch of editing on this video. It's not going to be like a professional YouTuber video essay or something. Also, I do want to say that this is going to start out pretty negative because I really did not enjoy the game at first. But stick in there because ultimately I do like the game. So if you start getting upset with the things I'm saying early, just know that things get better later. And I also want to say my favorite game of all time is WoW as it existed from the first couple expansions. So there kind of was never going to be a situation where there was any chance I was going to think this game was better than that. Um, but I do certainly think it's a lot better than retail. I haven't played retail in a long time. So I'm just going to get started talking about basically chronologically how it went down. So right off the bat, it was pretty hard to get my account set up properly. Mog Station, I would say, is not a very good website. It feels very archaic. It feels like something you would see from like the year 2005 or something. And in addition to that, I had a specific issue where about 2 years ago or so, somebody gave me a game code for Final Fantasy 14, and at that time I was like, yeah, sure, I'll give it a shot. So I put in the game code, downloaded the client, and tried to install it, and I kept having an issue in the middle of installation. I was like, well, you know what? I wasn't really that invested in playing this in the first place, so whatever. So after that, 2 years pass, and I decide, okay, everyone's there's this big influx of people playing 14. It's a good chance to give it a try because just for some context, Final Fantasy is one of my favorite franchises. I've played every non-MMO game in the franchise, so I did eventually want to play this. But because I had that the key the like code already put in, it said my account exists, and as a result, I can't do the free Heavensward free ARR trial that everybody always talks about. And the only way I could do that is if I made a new account, which would mean making a new email and all this. So I was already getting to a point where I was like, well, okay, maybe I'll give up on this again. But fortunately, it turns out they were doing a promotion where returning players could get 2 weeks free. I wasn't really a returning player since I had literally never logged into the game, but that's what I was considered. So I was able to play. But that was only kind of the start of issues because then I went, okay, well, let's make my character. I went through the process of creating my dude, went through all of the options, which was pretty cool how many customization options there were, a lot more than WoW. I really liked that. But then when it came to, well, actually, I guess technically you pick the server first. So I already knew which server I wanted because I knew what server my friends were on. And under the data center, there was maybe 6 or 7 servers, and only 2 of those I could pick from. And thankfully, one of the ones I could pick was the server I wanted. So I picked that, made my character, went through all of the options, and then I put in the name Thunder Craig, and it said, "Oh, that's taken." So it took me, 10 or 15 minutes to think of a new name, Tugboat McGuire. And once I had thought of that, I was like, "All right, cool, let's get started playing." And it says, "Sorry, you can't create a character on this server. It's full now." And I'm just like, are you kidding me? Because like it was just a really bad, like, it feels like they didn't ever expect. I guess in some way the massive influx has been a problem for them, but it's also just like you would think there would be some way around this. Like I couldn't go into a queue to wait for it. I couldn't, be. It didn't say like, oh, when will this be available again? Instead, I just had to Google, and on Google, they're basically like, oh yeah, well, if you make a character at like 5 a.m., then it'll probably happen, which is really just a ridiculous way to go around this. Why can't there just be a queue? Because later on, I would figure out, there are server queues for logging in. Why can't there be a character creation queue? Even if it's a really long time, I would be like, sure, yeah. I mean, I don't have to play right now. 3 hour queue to create the character, that's fine. But nothing like that. So unfortunately, I just was like kind of out of options. I was thinking like, do I just create a character on other servers? It's kind of a big decision, really. I know that there's the ability to go to other servers to play with people, but it's still like you can't be in their guild, whatever they call those free companies. Um, so yeah, it really was leaving a very bad taste in my mouth right at the start before I'd even actually played the game. But eventually, after waiting, 20 or 30 minutes, it did allow me to make a character, and I was able to finally get started. So I started out as a warrior, or rather a marauder, which means that I started in Limsa Lominsa. I think that maybe it would have been better if I started in a different zone because something about this zone just didn't really work for me. Part of it is there's like this weird way they have the town set up where there's just a lot of loading zones to go to different floors, and it just felt very jarring and like broken up and awkward. But also part of it was just I didn't understand how this game worked, and I don't feel like it did the greatest job getting me started because I just immediately started doing quests in town, and all the quests were just pointless stuff like, oh, walk around town, talk to another NPC, come back here, and I got up to level like 5 or so from doing this, all without really doing the main story quest, which it turns out that at least in a Realm Reborn, for your first character, basically, if you're doing anything other than the main story quest, you're pretty much just wasting your time because almost all of the content in the game is locked behind that. It's basically an attunement quest chain that unlocks every single thing in the game, every dungeon, the story itself, the ability to progress further, etc. So basically, I was wasting my time for the first hour or so of the game, just kind of wandering around, wondering when will I ever get to leave town and actually fight something or do anything. So, that's partially on me, but I feel like the game didn't do the best job sort of explaining that a lot of this is outdated content that you don't need to do and is pointless. So eventually, I did get to leave town and finally got to do combat. Uh, Compared to WoW Classic, I would say the combat's a lot slower. Obviously, there's a slower GCD, and I know, yeah, later down the line, there's off GCD abilities and all that, but it just doesn't feel quite as responsive. And jumping ahead a little bit, even when you get stuff like the interrupts or stuns, they seem to take like a couple of seconds after you use them. Like in WoW, if something's casting a spell and you use pummel or kick or whatever, just instantaneously, boom, that's gone. Here, you have to sort of do it preemptively. Like if they have a fast cast time, you literally have to use your ability before the cast even starts and just hope to guess right, which is definitely a little awkward. But it's just kind of how the game's set up. I'm not necessarily saying that it's terrible or anything. It's just it feels a lot less snappy and a lot less fast and clean than WoW does. And it's especially apparent at the early game where you really don't have many abilities, which means that you're basically using like one ability every 2.5 seconds, and it's just pretty boring. I will say the combat gets much, much better later, obviously. But it's definitely something that you have to really get past when you first start playing the game that might impede a new player's progress, I would say. I think exploration is one of the most important parts of any MMO or even really just any open world game. And I feel like a Realm Reborn really struggled with this, especially at the start. And I think part of this is because people start in different zones and they sort of had to put them all together. But even beyond that, the way the main story quest takes you, it's just kind of bouncing you all over the place, almost seemingly at random, and you never really get to fully engage with the zone before moving on to the next one and then later coming back, etc. Most quests in the main story quest just seem to be go to a place, talk to a person, maybe do one really quick thing right outside of that town, like kill 2 or 3 enemies or click on an object on the ground and then come back and talk and have another cutscene. And it just kept doing this ad nauseum for basically the entirety of the main story quest. And because of this, you're just constantly bouncing back and forth, taking airships, teleporting to these stones, using these I forget what they call them, but they're sort of like pieces of paper that teleport you to different places. And because of all this constant teleportation, everything feels extremely disjointed. By the end of A Realm Reborn, I still couldn't tell you the geography of the main continent at all. I had no idea where Ul'dah was. I had no idea where Limsa Lominsa was, Gridania, etc. And all of these places I had been to many times, but every time I'm going there, I'm just clicking, okay, teleport me here, teleport me there. And it's sort of one of those things where I feel like fast travel is something important in an MMO, but I feel like it's also something that usually is kind of a later game reward. Like think about RuneScape, you eventually get your magic level up high enough that you can teleport, and it's really cool and it's very convenient. But before that, you have to sort of work with other slower ways of travel. And it kind of feels like a Realm Reborn used to have these, and maybe this is just something that they've gotten rid of because there's all these chocobos, but you can't. Well, you can ride them, but there's just no reason to because you could teleport. So my understanding is at some point the teleport had some sort of cooldown and it doesn't anymore. And I feel like that really makes everything feel very disjointed where I'm just constantly flashing from one place to the next without any real context of where I'm at. And on a similar note, the zones just feel hard to believe a lot of the time. Like to go back to WoW Classic, a lot of the zones basically tell a story through the environment by having, there's this group of enemies over here, and even if you're not really paying attention to the story, you still have some sense of, oh, okay, these guys are bad, there's some other faction over here. But every zone in Realm Reborn is more or less just, okay, there's a bunch of like set dressing type enemies, like here's some birds or some ladybugs or, an elemental or whatever. It's never anything that really contributes to the story because all of these factions are basically friends. So really, the only enemies you have are the areas where there's Imperials, which I also feel is a little bit immersion breaking because it feels like so many towns are like right next door, and they even made a joke about this in one of the quests where they're like, "Oh, nobody would make a town right next to a castrum," and it's like, well, it's kind of funny, but it's also like, yeah, it's very weird when I walk right outside of town and I can literally see an enemy base next door. So it just feels like all of the areas are a little too small to work properly. And I think also because it doesn't really encourage you to do side quests, you don't really get as full of a picture. Though I will say a lot of the main story quests for Realm Reborn feels kind of like side quests where it'll be like, oh, you're going and dealing with the problem the Sylphs are having or that the Amalja are having or whatever. So it does sort of do this a little bit, but not really in ways that feel appropriate to me. So I would say that I was just kind of coasting along with the game for a while. And the first time that I really started like actually having fun was the first dungeon, Satasha, and I kind of enjoyed that there was a little bit of a build up to the dungeon, a little bit of story context before you attune to it and are able to go into it. Like in WoW, you could technically go into a dungeon as soon as you have the proper level. There's usually quests that'll lead you into them, but theoretically you could go whenever you want. And I thought it was sort of cool how you attune to this and how you wind up attuning to every dungeon, and they pretty much all have some context within the story. I also enjoyed getting to explore it because it was a little bit different than what you would expect from a WoW dungeon. Like enemies were dropping keys that would open doors. There were a bunch of optional rooms, which, in early WoW they would have stuff like this too, like obviously Blackrock Depths, that sort of thing. But eventually they became very linear. Which, to be fair, later on in Final Fantasy XIV, I would say most of the dungeons wind up that way too. But it was kind of cool, and I enjoyed getting to explore this dungeon. And people seemed to be ready to let me do that. I was the tank, which is funny because I've done this dungeon a bunch of times now through the roulettes and things like that. And I would say people pretty much always try to speedrun it. So it was a little bit interesting that my first experience was people being cool about doing that. Because I feel like a lot of people are sort of in a hurry to get through them. And I can't really blame them. Nobody wants to be in Satasha for a really long time, which I basically killed every enemy when I was there the first time. But it was a nice experience to mix things up. And instead of just it was the first time where I actually got to engage in combat in the game for like an extended period of time, as opposed to just cutscene after cutscene after cutscene. And one thing that was nice about this part of the main story quest is right after Satasha, there was like maybe two or three more dungeons just right in a row after it. I did think it was a little bit strange that Satasha kind of had a build up to it for the story, and the other dungeons were just kind of like, all right, let's go. But I wasn't about to complain because it was a lot more fun than doing the rest of the main story quest had been up to that point. One thing that was pretty shocking about the main story quest was when I fought Ifrit. It felt like this was really, really early in the game to be fighting, basically a god, basically a super iconic character. And that's not to say you don't fight Ifrit early in a lot of Final Fantasy games, but here they sort of had built these up as like these are like world-ending threats that are not going to be easy to dispatch. And at this point in the story, my character hadn't really been established to be the Warrior of Light yet. It was just kind of like, yeah, you're just kind of a guy helping the Scions out. And I guess this was sort of how they sort of started to figure out, like, oh, you have the Echo, which is this like superpower that lets you be able to fight primals. Um, but even so, it just felt jarringly early. That being said, the fight was really fun. Looking back on it now, it's extremely simple, but just for the context of where I was at so far in the game, there had been hardly any mechanics. And so a fight with even just a few mechanics and a lot of flashiness and some cool music, which, by the way, a lot of the music in this game is very good, was very, very fun. Unfortunately, right after you fight Ifrit is what I would consider easily the worst part of the game so far. It was the closest I came to quitting by a long shot. I really did not know if I was going to continue playing the game at this point. But basically, they have you for like an hour straight go to every major city and talk to the faction leaders there. So Merylweb will have a 10-minute speech about nothing really, and then Alphino will give you another like dissertation on it, and then you go to Ul'dah and do the same thing because this is when you're supposed to be picking which company you're going to join. But it was the most boring thing that I'd ever experienced. I just could not stand it. And it just felt like there was just a extraordinarily long amount of time of really, really long cutscenes that just would not end before you finally get to do a dungeon again. And I was like, most of the way through that when I was just like, I don't know if I can keep playing this. I'm so bored and I don't know when this is going to get good. But fortunately, I would say after that hump, it did get significantly better. And I mean, basically, what it boils down to is I wish, because, coming into this, everyone always talked about how great the story is in Final Fantasy XIV, and how it's like one of the best stories ever told. It's just amazing for an MMO. But the truth is, so many of the scenes in A Realm Reborn just feel like they go on and are so pointless. And I genuinely feel like I would not have missed anything if I had skipped probably 80% of the cutscenes. If I had just started a cutscene and seen, okay, is anything important happening within the first like 5 or 6 lines of dialogue? Okay, skip it. You'd probably be fine, honestly. And I would say very little happens in the story overall until the very end of it. But man, it was really rough, and I was getting very, very frustrated. Just like a lot of little grating things had been adding up at this point. But overall, I'm definitely glad I stuck with it. It definitely got better after Realm Reborn, and even the Realm Reborn campaign got better after this point. But it was rough. I would say that once I got to Hawk Manor, which is basically a haunted mansion dungeon that has a bunch of extra spots to go to, just like that first dungeon, which I obviously explored all of it when I was doing it the first time. Now, obviously, I speedrun it every time, but that was very enjoyable. And then Titan was a super cool fight, even though I did feel like a couple of mechanics were a little obtuse. One thing is he does this thing where he jumps up and lands in the middle, and you're supposed to be as far away from it as possible. And there's like a circle on the outer ring. So at first I was like, okay, obviously I'm supposed to dodge the circle on the outer ring, but then you take damage based on how close you are to him. So I was like, oh, maybe you're supposed to go all the way to the outer ring. That's what that's indicating. No, it's actually saying you'll fall off the edge, which now I understand, knowing more about the game. But it definitely felt a little bit strange because in the past, anytime there was like a red mark, it was basically like if you didn't stand on this, you aren't going to take damage. And in this case, it was sort of like, well, if you stand on the red mark, you're going to die. If you don't stand on the red mark, you're going to take damage. So it's kind of giving you a bit of a mixed message there. But obviously, I understand the fight now. But the first time I did it, it was a little strange. But that said, it was a really cool fight and definitely something that revitalized me after that kind of doldrum of a bunch of boring cutscenes. And I would say after that, it's not that long till you go to the Skyrim area called Korthus or something. It's the area outside of the like Ishgard faction, which you don't actually get to go till the first expansion. But that area was really cool. I like the story of trying to figure out that there's like a fake person, a heretic pretending to be a member of the church there. It's pretty neat. Um, because there were a few parts where there's little side stories like that I thought were enjoyable, but I felt like the overall narrative in A Realm Reborn was kind of lacking in cohesion. And speaking of the overall story of A Realm Reborn, I felt like Ascians were just not very satisfying as enemies. I think that they're supposed to get more interesting around Shadowbringers. I would say even now, where I'm at, which is part of the way through Stormblood, I don't feel like they're very compelling villains. They're just kind of like generic dark evil figures. And there's a point where it turns out that one of the main Ascians that you've encountered so far is Thancred, which seems like it should be really jarring and like, oh wow, we're betrayed. But it turns out he's just being mind controlled, and it's like it doesn't really go anywhere or have any real relevance to the plot. It's very similar to in Final Fantasy IV. Several times your party members get mind controlled by Golbez, and it just doesn't really feel like there was much of a point to it. So there's a lot of little like contrivances like that where I'm just like, okay, all right, moving on, I guess. But that said, it's kind of cool to have Thancred as a villain. I think going into the Scions a little bit, I really didn't enjoy a lot of the Scions in A Realm Reborn, and I felt like they were kind of Avengers-y, but they weren't actually really doing anything. They just kept saying, all right, let's all have another meeting, and then you leave and you come back and have a meeting, and they don't do anything. You go out and do something. They're still not doing anything. And it just feels like, why am I even on this team? But Thancred was one of the ones where I actually kind of liked him. I kind of liked Ishtola. Kind of liked Alphino. The rest I was kind of not as into. Papalimo and Yida I really disliked. Minfilia, I thought her voice was really annoying. But I would say that Thancred was kind of one of the cool ones. So the fact that he was the one chosen to be sort of a betrayer was at least for a split second was like, oh, okay, this could be interesting, and it just didn't really go anywhere. Really, I think a lot of the A Realm Reborn story had potential, and I liked, for example, Sid Garland. I liked that he started out as this cloaked figure, and obviously he was apparently a character in the original Fantasy 14, so it works on that level, but it's also just kind of like, it's a character named Sid, so obviously once you figure that out, it's like, oh, it's Sid, he's going to make the airship and all this, he's going to be an important character. And the fact that he was a former Imperial, the son of the Emperor, I think that sort of gives him some interesting motivations to sort of make amends and join your party. And so I sort of like that whole arc where you're finally going to fight against the Empire and fight against all these villains that keep popping up. But unfortunately, I feel like those final two dungeons probably were pretty cool when it first came out, but here they're really not interesting at all due to the fact that they're part of a queue. They're part of the main scenario queue, which means that everyone's like synced down, but they have gear that's so much stronger than what you would normally have at this. That just everything gets obliterated, and everyone's done this a million times. And it's an 8-person thing, so it's not like you can really go at your own pace. Instead, you're just blitzing through. Like the very first time I did the final dungeon, I'm like, okay, let's fight these mobs, and then the entire party runs past me and uses the elevator. I'm like, uh, okay, well, fuck me, I guess. So I try to hop on the elevator, but it's like really hard to click the button because you're getting attacked and interrupted a million times. And that whole dungeon is basically that, where it's just everyone trying to skip past everything as quick as possible, which I don't blame them for. They're giving substantial rewards to players for going back and doing this content, but it just creates a bad experience for your a first time player. And obviously, that's the best possible experience you can have as a later player is let's not do this for very long. So I don't know. I feel like maybe there's some other way they could encourage players to redo that content without it being that the meta is just speedrun it completely and don't let the new players really appropriately enjoy it, because it's not like it's just some random dungeon, right? If it's some random dungeon and people are blitzing through it, yeah, okay, whatever. This is the conclusion of the story, and everything's being skipped through. And I understand that in the past you could even skip cutscenes, so you would be watching the first cutscene, they have completely cleared the dungeon basically. Here they force you to watch the cutscenes at least, which is somewhat of an aid to new players, but even still the experience is pretty bad. Like you find the somewhat iconic, like this is one of the characters that I actually thought was kind of interesting in Realm Reborn and continues to be good down the line, which is Nero, a member of the Imperials, and one of the Garleans, that is. And you kill him in like 15 seconds because your DPS is just going to be so high that it's ludicrous. So it sort of is like you've built up all these characters, and then it's just completely pointless because everyone's so scaled up that you don't get to enjoy it. Like, they've built up the ultimate weapon, like, oh, it's harnessed the power of all these primals that you'd been fighting the entire game, and here's this ultimate threat that's going to destroy Eorzea and take it over for the Imperials. And then, no, I mean, you're going to kill it in like a minute flat because everyone's so strong. Now, having said all of this, that was the entire part of the game that I really did not enjoy. I would have said it was probably like a 4 or 5 out of 10. I really had a bad time. You know, Going into it, I had heard, oh, Realm Reborn's pretty bad. You might want to boost past it, which I was obviously never going to boost past it. I don't even know if now, having experienced it, I would encourage anyone to boost past it. I still feel like you should kind of not do that. I feel like paying companies money to not play the content they made is just a really insane idea, and I've always thought that about WoW level boosting as well. So I'm very glad that I got past that because the truth is it gets so much better immediately as soon as you finish the 2.0 campaign. Once you're in the patches, it's immediately way better. And once you're getting to do stuff more casually, it's better too because you do have the option to do some casual stuff in Realm Reborn, but you're like so limited in the amount of content you've unlocked that there's really just not a lot to do. Whereas once you hit 50, all of the stuff opens up. You get a bunch of roulettes. You can continue doing the main story quest. You have easier ways to level up your alt jobs. I mean, I guess technically you could level up your alt jobs earlier too, but it's sort of weird because now you're at a point where it's like, okay, well, you're stuck at level 50 quests, whereas before you couldn't really keep up two jobs to be doing the main story quest, and here you have the opportunity to catch up a second job to level 50 because the quests are all going to be level 50 until you reach Heavensward. So you kind of actually have time to finally take a breather and have fun really with the game. And that's what I did, because it opened a bunch of all of these queues. You had the trials, the level 50 dungeons, and you still obviously had the leveling queue. You also got the raids opened up, the alliance raids, that is. So you just sort of immediately get so much more content to do once you hit 50 that it almost feels like a completely different game. Because really, it felt like before this, there was literally exactly one thing I should be doing, which is the main story quest. And now it's like, okay, let's take a break from the main story quest. You can do whatever you want. There's a bunch of things to attune to. There's all these hard mode dungeons, which, by the way, I think is really cool. I do think it's a little bit strange that they call them hard when it's not really so much that they're hard, it's more that they're set to level 50. They're basically like any other dungeon. I was expecting them to be like heroics in WoW, where it's like, okay, you're going to need to use some CC. People are going to actually need to be paying attention. But no, it's more or less just like pretty easy. You can still pull a bunch of packs and AoE them. But what was really cool about them is the fact that they don't even have the same layout. They're usually like the same location, but a different part of the location, a different story with the location, different bosses. I think that's a really, really neat way to do that, and I really enjoyed that. And some of those level 50 dungeons have really cool mechanics too. Like one that really blew me away. Actually, I can't remember the name of the dungeon, but basically, towards the end of it, you go down this like dark corridor, this like spiral staircase thing, and you fight Diabolos. Um, and it's really cool. He has this mechanic that nobody in my party, all of us, it was all of our first time in the dungeon, so none of us knew the mechanic. So we instantly wiped to the mechanic a couple of times till we realized, oh, because we knew that basically what happens is a bunch of gates open up, and you can click on the gates to open the doors, but it's kind of like, okay, how does this work with his instant kill move? And it turns out at the start of the fight, the doors flash like these symbols above each door. So what you have to do is you have to have people do like a matching game where you each open the two doors that match at the same time, and it'll like suck up all of your teammates and protect them from the instant kill mechanic. And just like the process of figuring that out with a group that didn't know it was really a lot of fun. I also enjoyed the idea of these poetics, which are like a currency that you collect from doing these dungeons that you can then turn in for basically, I guess the idea would be like a somewhat recent patch equivalent gear, but since it's level 50, instead it's just like max level 50 gear, whatever the item level is for that, which is a good way to get you to catch up and also have sort of a non-leveling, non-main story quest sense of progression for your character. And obviously, because of the fact that there's a bunch of different jobs, you can start collecting sets for other classes as well, and you sort of have like a lot of uses for them. As for the Crystal Tower, I liked the fact that it had a whole narrative around it. I liked all the Final Fantasy III music and the Final Fantasy III bosses and references. I always thought Final Fantasy III was kind of an underrated game. I thought it was quite fun despite being, a really early game in the franchise. But I will say the way they're tuned, it again feels kind of like looking for Raid, where there's really no challenge to be had, and you can largely ignore the mechanics and still be completely fine. But it was still kind of cool just to play with that many other players at once, and also just to have a little bit of extra content to do. I did think it was a little bit silly that, you know, the last part of the Realm Reborn story had basically just happened, at least when I was doing this, and then Nero shows up and everyone's just like, it's cool, Nero. We beat the Empire, so like it's fine. I'm sure you're not going to do anything evil. And then he's like, haha, I'm doing evil shit. And it's like, oh, fuck. Damn, there was no way we could have seen this coming. But even still, I felt like he had some cool development there. And, I'm only at the start of Stormblood, but he's shown up in Stormblood, and I'm excited to see where his whole plot will go. Because I do, like I said earlier, think he's one of the more interesting characters. But by far and away, and frankly, this is no surprise, my favorite thing about this part was the fact that I could finally do extreme trials. These are very, very fun. Um, I haven't done any with minimum eye level or silencing echo, but I've done them all through Duty Finder, except for Thorn March. That's the only one I haven't done. And they've all been super, super fun. And it's actually quite fun to do them with a pug because, frankly, a lot of people are not going to play well, and it's going to be it kind of adds challenge to it where it's like you have to try and teach these people how to play and teach them what to do and try to micromanage them. And it also, like, when I was entering these, I wasn't knowing the mechanics either. So, I was asking the players that had already experienced it, like, what do I do, et cetera, et cetera. Especially as tank, like, are there tank swaps? Do I need to pick up ads, et cetera, et cetera. And a lot of them do have tank swaps and have ads. So, they're really well designed fights. I especially like Rama and Leviathan. Leviathan in particular is great because it's one of those fights where it's like everyone has personal responsibility. There's so many ways you can instantly and permanently die, and you need everyone to really be paying attention to actually beat it. And so I've had so much fun with those. That said, one thing that's really weird is the fact that, and this is kind of getting ahead of myself, but eventually there's a mechanic called Wondrous Tales, which kind of encourages you to do specific bits of content every week to get special rewards. They're kind of like a bunch of weekly quests or something. Um, but the way it works with the extreme trials is you can just do them unsynced, so you can just like bring a high level player and just one shot the boss, which seems to defeat a lot of the points of me, but whatever, I'll just not really do that often and have fun with it. But yeah, I mean, that makes me really excited to see what the max level raids are going to be like, what the ultimates are going to be like, once I eventually get through Shadowbringers and possibly have to wait till Endwalker, depending on, how far I get before all that comes out. But definitely excited to see how the hardest content in this game works out, because really, like, the raids are well designed and are very fun. Or maybe raid is the wrong word, but the 8+ person encounters are quite fun. And another thing that I had a lot of fun with during this period, funny enough, was leveling alts, doing just like side quests and levy quests and hunts and, just kind of killing mobs and just like walking around. I was like, I wish that this is what the experience was like for my first character, right? Like, I wish that I could have done more non-main story quest things and have it feel like I had a reason to be doing them. Like when I was playing my black mage, I was just having a lot of fun even doing levy quests. Like, it was just like fun to like be like, okay, let's you can like set what level they'll be, make them higher level, try to do them as fast as possible to get maximized rewards. It sort of gives you some sense of a challenge, something to do. Going around doing fates, it was just a lot more fun than doing the main story quest, which was just really not that pleasant for Realm Reborn. Um, so I wish that maybe they had something that kind of encouraged you to do a little bit of both, which I assume is, how the game actually worked when it first came out. I basically what I'm saying is I assume a Realm Reborn was much better when it first came out, and now it's kind of like this weird, trivial sort of thing you're forced to go through. Uh, but I think that the content, like at its core, had the potential to be good, and probably at some time was good and fun. And I also really have been enjoying Black Mage, by the way. I really like the way it plays. It reminds me a lot of Moonkin from back in the day with the Eclipse system in World of Warcraft, the way you go back from the fire side to the ice side. And it just has a lot of interesting things about the mechanics. As for the post content in A Realm Reborn, I feel like the patch content story, a lot of them were just kind of like little side stories that seemed to be setting up things for much, much later. But I still felt like it was overall a lot better, like getting the Dome and Refugees, which obviously wouldn't come till Stormblood to actually matter. Uh, but also just the way it sort of starts to set up Heavensward. I feel like all of that was a lot more interesting than pretty much anything that happened in all of the Realm Reborn. even though I think a lot of people acted like this content was pretty bad, and I do think that apparently it got cut down a lot. Like I think they removed a lot of extra patches. I don't know all the details on that, obviously, but as it exists right now, it was a marked improvement over the original 2.0 content, and I really enjoyed it. Or maybe I really enjoyed it. It's a little bit strong, but I enjoyed it a lot more than Realm Reborn, and it sort of set me up for expecting much better things to come, which is indeed what would wind up happening. And actually, the way that it winds up wrapping up with the coup in Ul'dah, I thought was very cool because it was the first time in the story where it felt like there were really any stakes, and bad things were happening. That being said, it took a lot of suspension of disbelief for me to believe this at all. It's like, okay, well, I've saved the world from primals like what, 5, 6, 7 times now. I stopped the ultimate weapon. Everybody knows that Tugboat Maguire is a force for good in the realm, is a fucking great dude. And you're just gonna be like, oh, well, the Sultan is dead, so clearly you did that, and everyone's gonna believe you, or everyone's gonna believe this little fucking gnome guy. Like, give me a break. It's a little bit ridiculous. But that being said, just the fact that anything was happening at all, I was like, you know what? I don't care. It's fine. It's cool. I like that things are going down. And then Raubon gets his cool moment where he fucking cuts that dude in half to Leggy out of Leggy. And then you think he's going to do it again for Lola Rito, but nope. You're being betrayed by the Crystal Braves. That was great. Really enjoyed that part. And I will say that maybe this is getting ahead of myself again with the way the whole fallout from the coup works out in Heavensward. It winds up being kind of like, this was pretty contrived. Like the fact that the Sultan is not actually dead, and Lola Rito didn't face any real consequences, even though he still kind of went along with this. Like, I get that he quote unquote saved her by switching the poison out for a non-lethal poison, but it's like, okay, well, you still knew she was getting poisoned and poisoned her, and intentionally set up a situation where you thought to let you would likely get killed, and just all this bad shit. And it's like, I don't know. It feels like they wanted something really dramatic to end a Realm Reborn, and then later we're like, all right, that was too much. Let's undo all of that. Like, I find it hard to believe that they intended it to unfold the way it did, but maybe I'm wrong. But it just felt awkward at a certain point. But again, the fact that it was so cinematic and cool and something was actually happening, I still really enjoyed that part. And then the trailer for Heavensward, which has scenes from that, so cool. The music's great. It really like sets up like, hey, this is going to be a lot better. And indeed, Heavensward is way, way, way better. The first thing that just really shocked me was just how much better the zones felt. Because, like I said earlier, the zones in A Realm Reborn didn't necessarily feel that believable, and also didn't really feel like they told that much of a story. Whereas here, you actually do get to explore these zones, and you get to have quests that sort of like take you across the entire zone and do tell a story and let you know about the beings that live in each zone, what they're like, and also you have an actual encouragement to explore a little bit, which is the Aether Currents. So basically, in A Realm Reborn, you eventually get the ability to fly whenever you want, which I understand is a thing they added later. In the original game, you couldn't fly, period. But with Heavensward, you can fly, but in order to fly, you have to collect every Aether Current that's all over the world map, and there's a bunch of little side quests that let you get them too. And it's just a really great system that encourages you to actually explore the environment, look around, be like, oh, there's one. You also have a compass if you want to track them down specifically, but I usually didn't really do that until just getting the last couple, because the way they do it is pretty much if you do the side quest that will give you Aether Currents and you do the main quest, you're going to wind up going in all the locations that do have these Aether Currents if you just keep your eyes peeled. And it was really just like a fun little mini game of looking around and being like, oh, there's a ramp here. I bet if I go up here, there's going to be an Aether Current on this roof or something. And sure enough, there usually is. So I really, really liked that. And another thing that's just great about Heavensward is it actually feels more like you're playing an actual Final Fantasy game where you have a party. Like, instead of it being about the Avengers and the Scions where you just keep going back and they're not doing anything, here instead you have a specific party following you for a huge portion of the expansion. You have Ysael, who is this character that's basically pro dragons, and you have Asinian, who's this character that's basically anti dragons. So you have this cool dynamic where they're basically enemies, but they're all part of on the same quest for peace with the dragons. And you also have Alfino, your old bro, one of the scions that I actually liked. And so it's just you get to explore and go through the story in a way that's a lot more enjoyable because you have these party members who sort of have these unfolding stories and these arcs where they change over time and get redemption, etc. And it's like, it's just a lot more fun that way than it was in the original, where it's just focused on your character when your character doesn't really have that much about them because it's a custom character, right? I also feel like the dungeons and trials in this expansion were quite good. Though I will say the dungeons by this point had sort of taken a turn where everything is very linear in a way that it wasn't as much in Realm Reborn, which does make some of the dungeons in Realm Reborn a little bit cooler, in my opinion. Because it is neat to have a dungeon where it's like, it's this actual sprawling place where if you go over here, maybe you'll find a treasure chest, and if you go over here, maybe you'll find some other little extra tidbit or side thing. Um, Instead of just being, yeah, it's a hallway with a lot of cool, flashy things happening, which has its appeal too. And like I said, the dungeons are very good. One thing that I also noticed while doing this expansion is there's this buff you get whenever you do solo duties called like Brilliant Conviction or something, and it doesn't really tell you what it does. It says something like breaking limits like a true warrior of light or something like that. And I wound up having to look this up, and basically it just like buffs you a bunch and gives you a bunch of like regen health and stuff. So I usually click this off because I was realizing that like these solo duties, like you basically never have any chance to fail. So once I realized that, it got a lot more fun where it's like, okay, I actually have to be careful with my life total. I have to use my mitigation cooldowns to try and do this. I have to like think, I have to stun, etc. And they're still generally very easy, but it at least makes it so that it's not just like I'm just like trampling over all these things with really reckless abandon and it doesn't matter. And I will say there have been a couple of these situations where I failed the first time, which it does make you start over the entire thing, which is a bit much sometimes. But I still feel like that's more rewarding than just having no risk of failure at all. Ultimately, I would say Heavensward fixed almost all of the major issues I had with the Realm Reborn. The story was a lot better. It was a lot more focused. Um, there was actually interesting character development. The zone explorations were much better, and ultimately it just felt like more of an actual Final Fantasy game than a Realm Reborn did. As for the post-game Heavensward content, I actually haven't gotten to do that much of it because I've just been spending a lot of time leveling alts, honestly, like level Dark Knight to 50. I've been leveling a White Mage a little bit. I got my Black Mage caught up to my Warrior so that I can do Stormblood quests with it as well. I even tried Gunbreaker, which I don't really like just because there's this there's a combo system in Final Fantasy where basically it's really not that complicated. It's basically like you use one ability, then the next ability, then the next ability. But Gunbreaker has two of them, so it takes up six buttons, and there's not really like a good way to consolidate this. In PvP, you can have your combo set to just one button where you just hit the button three times. And if it was WoW or something, I'm sure there'd be a way to set up a macro or have an add-on that would do this. But here it's just like, okay, so I have to like bloat up my keyboard to have six buttons for this. And to be fair, Gunbreaker seems quite complicated. There's a lot of off GCD abilities, and it looks like it would be a lot of fun. But it's just kind of awkward to set this up, and it's also awkward because you have to have the same keybind set up for different classes. Like you can obviously change where your buttons are, but like if you wanted to completely change what your setup was, you can't really do that in a way that in WoW you obviously could with a different alt because it's a completely different character, right? So I didn't really feel that strongly that I needed to invest time to figure out how to do it optimally, just because that seems like kind of an awkward barrier. And there are a lot of little things like that that I'll probably get into a little bit later in this video that are a little annoying. But anyway, yeah. So I've really been enjoying leveling up a lot of alts. I've been doing the Wondrous Tales all the time, which I mentioned earlier. Those are basically the weekly quest type things. That's been a fun way to level up my alts as well. And I did do all of the main story quest stuff, but I haven't done like that many of the extremes. I haven't done the I think it's the Alliance raid. I did the normal raids of Alexander, which I would say felt even more trivial than Crystal Tower. Maybe it'll be fun to try those on Savage, but the way that the duty finder worked for them, it was just kind of like, okay, yeah, I mean, there's not much to say about these. I've started doing the Warring Triad. The first one was fun. I haven't done the other two yet. I also, just touching on the the main story quest content for Post-Heavensward. At one point, you have to go back and fight Titan again, which I thought was just a really weird choice. Where it's like, well, this is supposed to be new content, but here you're just queuing up for something you could have always done. And I would say overall, I felt like the post Heaven Sword content was a lot weaker than the post Realm Reborn content or Heaven Sword itself. But it was still okay. The whole Warrior of Darkness arc to me felt really weak, and I didn't feel like they made for very interesting villains. And also, they had the whole thing where Urianger like kind of, sort of betrayed you to work with them, but not really. And I feel like it was another thing where it was like when Thancred betrayed you, kind of, and it's like, all right, I'd honestly prefer at some point if one of these just like actually betrayed me rather than like these like weird contrivances. And also with Urianger's hidden identity thing, it was kind of the same thing with Thancred and the Griffin, where it's like you really, none of you are realizing that the Griffin is like clearly just doing the exact motivations that Ilberd had earlier, and it's just clearly going to be him. And then Alphino's like, "Oh, I should have known," and I'm like, "Yeah, no kidding, dude. I knew. You could have asked me." And in a similar thing with the mask thing, like Yida reveals her mask, and it's just like, okay, I don't know who you are, and then she's like, "Yeah, I'm Lise. I'm Yida's sister. Yida's dead," and I'm like, "All right, so I guess maybe Yida was like alive in the original Final Fantasy 14." It's like, "No, that was still Lise," and I'm like, "Oh, okay, so this just really means nothing to me at all." So I don't know. The game does a lot of things like that where it's just like it sets up things that like it almost feels like it wants you to think are shocking, and then they just don't really matter in any way. So I'm really not very far in Stormblood yet, so I don't have that much to say about it. I think I'm on like a level 62 quest or something. I'm about to leave Kagane for the first time. I will say right off the bat, it doesn't feel quite as exciting as Heavensward. Like the premise just isn't as interesting. But that said, like it's still been fine so far. I don't really have any complaints. The first dungeon that was on the boats at Kagane was very cool. I really enjoyed that dungeon, and also I kind of liked the duty that I had to do in Kagane, where it was kind of like a stealth thing where you would use this ability of these like smoke bombs to turn invisible and sneak by. It was really kind of clunky and cheesy, but I liked that it was at least, something different than the rest of the game had been. And I look forward to seeing them do more creative stuff like that. I would also say that the duty where you fight Xenos was kind of cool. It's like one of those situations where you're forced to lose, but he actually had like a lot of mechanics that would like blow up everything, and you need to kill things fast. And I tried doing it on my black mage at first, with obviously the brilliant conviction thing turned off, and I actually failed. So I was like, okay, you know what? Let me again do it without brilliant conviction, but I'll do it as warrior this time. And it worked out a lot better. But it was like a pretty cool little fight. And he also seems just kind of interesting, just because he's like the first time where like a human character has been like actually that intimidating to the warrior of light, right? And also the skulls as a faction seem kind of interesting in the sense that they're related. They're basically like kind of traitors to the Alamegan cause, but like not exactly. It's just kind of how they've grown up, right? So I'm curious to see how that whole story will unfold. So yeah, that's really all I have to say about Stormblood so far. I guess some of the zones look really cool as well. I've liked that. Uh, it is going full weeb game. I'm running around on the top of rooftops in like a Japanese town, but that's okay. It's allowed to be. Um, so yeah, I mean, other than that, I just have like a couple of other bullet points that didn't really fit into the whole like chronology of the game that I just want to bring up real quick. So one thing that's really jarring to me, and I feel like there's so much you could say about this, is the fact that there's no DPS meter and there's basically no feedback from the game if you're doing a bad job. Um, and in some ways, like maybe that's a good thing. Like this game obviously has a substantial amount of casual players who don't necessarily want to be told like, "Hey, you're bad, you're doing a bad job," etc. So I understand that, and obviously, WoW can be extraordinarily toxic. So I understand that they're trying to avoid that sort of meta or that sort of community. But that being said, it also gets to a point where it's like, you'll be in a dungeon and somebody will be doing like almost no damage and just not using their abilities at all. And it's like, is it bad for me to tell this person like, hey, try doing this, you'll do more damage, or that sort of thing? Because like I'm obviously not even supposed to know if they're doing damage like well or not, right? And it's just like, to me, it feels like one of the fun things about playing these sorts of games is getting better. Not only your character getting better, but you're getting better at the game. You're learning more things about your abilities and your rotation, and you're being a good asset to whatever team you're on. So the fact that you can just like queue up for an extreme and then have somebody completely ignore the mechanics and just keep dying, and there's really no recourse. You just have to be like, "That's okay, buddy. Yeah, you're doing great, bud." It's just a little bit like, I don't know. It's like it's kind of like infantilizes the base. I feel like, and I feel like there's like a better middle ground that could be reached between like WoW, where it's like they literally have completely replaced game masters with complete automation that doesn't work at all, so people can get away with doing heinous shit. Like truly, there was just disgusting stuff that happened in WoW Classic, like people paying thousands of dollars to buy other faction accounts, transferring them there to gank specific players over and over again, so they couldn't have world buffs in raids. Like truly ridiculous things. Obviously, that sort of thing, there needs to be some sort of moderation. And one thing that's so clearly better about FF14 is the fact that the company clearly cares about the game, whereas Blizzard, long ago stopped caring about the game, and especially Classic, they're like, whatever, it's not retail, we don't give a shit. So on some level, it's extremely refreshing to know, yeah, if you report someone, it's going to be looked at and they're going to look into it, and there might be something that happens about that. And that clearly leads to a better, nicer community. But on the flip side, it's also really uncomfortable to be in a group where somebody's not pulling their weight and there's no way to tell them, like, not even in like a mean way, but just like trying to help them still could be seen as like against terms of service, is very, very strange. And I would say at the very least, I feel like there should be some sort of option to have a DPS meter for yourself. Because even if it's like, hey, don't worry about what anyone else is doing, I would still want to know, am I doing well? Am I able to do more if I do this or that? Like when I started playing, like obviously I didn't really care for my warrior because it's a tank. Obviously I want to do damage, but it's not that important, right? Whereas for black mage, all I'm doing is damage, so I want to do as good of a job as I can. And it's kind of awkward because it's like, well, I mean, I can look up what other people say is the best time to be AoEing versus using this ability, or when I should use different rotations based on how much health things have. But if I don't have a DPS meter, I can't really see this objectively and in real time. Whereas if I do have one, I can actually make corrections and figure things out on the fly. And it also just like gives you something to like look at and to see, okay, am I performing well? And obviously it's not the only metrics, like people will always tunnel vision for DPS, ignore mechanics and stuff like that, and obviously it's important not to do that. um but yeah, I just feel like there has to be something better than, no, you're not allowed to have DPS meters, you're not even allowed to bring up damage. But yeah, I mean, it's not the end of the world, but it's just very strange. And on a similar topic of not having add-ons, the fact that you can't really modify your UI in all the ways I would want has been really frustrating. Like the options in game are fairly reasonable. You can resize things, you can move them around, you can have it set so that a bar will keep certain things. Like if you want to have one bar that's just like consumables and your return and teleports and sprints, if you just want to keep that the same for every class, you can. So there are a lot of things that it lets you do, but there's also a lot of things where it's just like, really? Like one thing in particular, when I was trying to resize my UI in the first place, it would be like, okay, what percentage do you want this to be at? Do you want it to be at 60%? No. You want it to be at 80%? And I'm like, well, I kind of want something in the middle. Why can't I just type in 70% or 75% or 65% or whatever? Instead, it's just like a drop down selection where it jumps between these numbers. And it's just so bizarre. It makes me wonder if there's like a technical reason why it has to be that way. Like if they like specifically created, oh, this is the 60% scale asset, rather than like it actually scaling dynamically by like an actual like, integer value or whatever. And similarly, just the way you can set up your UI, the interface where it's really awkward. And I think some of this might be because it also needs to work on controller, but just like even just basic like human computer interaction stuff is really fucked up. Like there'll be like a case where the OK button will be on the right on one screen, and then the next it'll be in the middle, and there'll be a different button on the right, and it's like, okay, well I clicked the wrong button. Okay, all right. Or just the fact that so many of the options that you can use are like based on that menu on the that's by default in the bottom right. It'll just have like a huge list of options, and it's just, I don't know, it just feels like the UI overall is the sort of thing where if add-ons were allowed, somebody would have fixed this and made it way, way, way better. Another small little awkward thing is the way Duty Finder works in conjunction with cutscenes. And it seems to be inconsistent as well. So, like, for example, if I want to queue as my Black Mage because it's DPS and it's going to take a while, maybe I'll want to go and do some main story quests in the meantime. But then if you get stuck in the middle of a cutscene, because you switch classes to Warrior or whatever, you won't be able to accept the queue until you skip the cutscene and switch jobs and then accept it all within like 40 seconds or however long it gives you. And this is particularly weird since it's like, why isn't there just an option to back out from the cutscene and be in the state right before it? Because that is what will happen if you accept the queue. But in some cases, you just can't accept the queue even if you're the right job. So obviously, the safe thing is just not to watch a cutscene. But really, I mean, if you want to use your time efficiently, like you should be able to watch the cutscenes. Because the other thing is, you never know how long cutscenes can be. Like this might be a 2 minute cutscene. Okay, cool. I'm glad I got that out of the way while I waited in this queue. And then sometimes it's like, oh, it's a 20-minute cutscene. So now I accepted the queue 5 minutes in. I have to skip back through it. It's not like the biggest thing in the world, but it's definitely something that's just like is grating and very annoying. Like I've certainly had to skip a cutscene or two as a result of this. I also touched on the fact earlier that a lot of the music in this game is really, really fantastic, but I feel like a lot of the cutscenes just use the same like 5 songs over and over again, and it just makes me wonder. Like, I mean, you have such a large soundtrack. Like, if you look at the like orchestrion or whatever it's called in your room, there are so many songs. So why not just like mix things up a little bit more? Because I get tired of hearing the same song so many times. I also don't like that this game does seem to have a lot of in-game purchases with real money, like mounts and outfits and that sort of thing. I don't think there's really any like quote unquote pay to win sort of thing, so it's not that big of a deal. Obviously, there are skips, which I guess you could frame as being pay to win, but it's not really that, to be honest. But yeah, I really wish MMOs hadn't gone in that direction. I really liked the like. There's just an appeal of there's cool items to get in this game, and the only way to do them is to do something cool in the game or to get really lucky to have something rare and special. And if it's just like, oh, everyone has something really cool because some people paid $20 to get it, or some people did something to get it, it just kind of diminishes the value of the game overall to me. And I don't think it's nearly as egregious as WoW Retail, where you're on the main login screen and it's like, hey, here's the button for buying a bunch of stupid shit, and you open the game and it's like, okay, yeah, here's all of your buttons you can use. Look at your character, you can look at your friend list, you can buy some shit from us. You want that? That's always good. And so it's nowhere near as invasive as that, and I give them massive credit for that. Like, you have to seek it out if you want to buy things, so that's great. But yeah, I do wish that that just wasn't the way that the genre went, I guess. And the last couple things I want to talk about are sort of like immersion or roleplay sort of things that I don't feel like work properly. One thing is having this silent protagonist who is also like an integral part of the story. Just to give some context, in WoW, you're basically a silent protagonist too, right? You're just an avatar, but you're not the warrior of light, right? You're just some guy who slowly over the course of your adventures, you're like, okay, yeah, I did all this cool shit. I defeated all these dungeons. I've gotten really strong. I've gotten good gear. And the story sort of like unfolds in a more intrinsic way, right? Where it's like your character is sort of whatever you project onto them. Whereas here, your character is a member of the Scions. Your character is the Warrior of Light. Your character is always doing all this nice shit for everyone because he's a really nice guy. And that's just strange to me, especially since I know a lot of people will start like extra characters for roleplay reasons, but it's like, well, in every cutscene, your character responds the same way as every other character in the game, right? You do occasionally have dialogue options that are kind of pointless, but it's a nice to have. Whereas like the fact that like the camera will always go to your character and then they'll like, oh, I'm explaining the situation or I'm nodding in approval or whatever, and it's just I feel like it projects a lot onto your character that it's kind of like I wish my character was just an actual character at that point instead of being my character. Like I kind of wish it was all one way or the other, right? Where it's like nothing is projected onto them and it's all up to me, or it's like in Final Fantasy 15, right? Like Noctis is a pretty like he's not a silent protagonist, but he doesn't talk that much. The other three party members are much more like engaged in conversation. He's just very quiet and he just says stuff when it's needed. So it's sort of this mix, right? Which is kind of what they do in 14 also, but it's weird since it's an MMO and it's a custom character rather than being an actual established character. And in the same vein, it's really weird that they chose to make it so that other characters are like other players, I mean, are basically not canon. Like as far as I understand it, you are the one warrior of light, even though everywhere you go there's thousands of other players who are all also the one warrior of light. And it's especially jarring when it's like, okay, so now I'm doing this trial and there's 8 people with me and we're fucking this primal up, and then the cutscene plays and it's just you, even though the cutscene that started was like your entire party. And it just feels like there were ways they could have easily made this work, right? Like, why not just say, oh, yeah, there's a bunch of warriors of light that have been released unto the world and they're all helping the scions, but you're the most important one because you're the player, right? Like, they could still have done this in ways that wouldn't be so, like, immersion breaking. And maybe this doesn't matter for a lot of people, but for me, it's like, it's just every time it happens, I'm just kind of like, okay. And a very similar thing is teleporting in this game. And I brought this up earlier when I was talking about a Realm Reborn, how it makes everything feel disjointed. But that's not what I'm talking about here. Here I'm talking about the story aspect of it. If, the Scions can teleport and you can teleport, why aren't you just teleporting out of all of these dangerous situations all the time? Because, like, every once in a while, oh, something bad happens. All right, let's get out of here. And they just teleport. But then other times, like the situation in Ul'dah, they have to come up with all these contrived reasons for like, oh, well, we didn't want to teleport because of this reason or that reason. And it's just, it feels like maybe maybe they should have just had teleporting be like, yeah, it's a video game, so you can teleport, but it's not actually part of the story. And maybe that would have been a lot better of a way to go, I feel like, because every single time something bad happens and it's like, oh, well, you guys should just leave. And they never do. It's like really makes some parts of the story hard to take seriously. And one last tiny little thing that I'm not sure if I like or dislike is the fact that every single thing in the game requires attunement. And I definitely think, obviously, as I brought up in the ARR part, I think it was bad for having to just do the main story quest to unlock everything there. But as far as like in-game stuff, I think it's kind of cool how it's like in order to unlock the hard modes, you actually have to like go back to the location again. But it's also kind of like, all right, I mean, like, I don't know, it feels a little bit silly to be forced to do this, but it's also cool just because like it's another way where it feels like you're progressing and unlocking something new. So I think overall I kind of do like it, but it's definitely a little bit of a strange choice when it's like even stuff like being able to use glamours or something like that, or unlocking PvP. Like all of these are things that you technically have to do some little attunement quest chain for. So yeah, I don't know. I kind of have a mixed view of that, but I think overall I kind of like it. So yeah, that was a lot. Thank you to anyone who stuck with me. Sorry if I upset anyone with anything I said. Obviously, some of it could be slightly inflammatory because there were a lot of complaints in there. There's a lot of things I really didn't like, especially early in the game. But overall, I really am having a lot of fun. And I'm definitely looking forward to seeing where the rest of the story goes. And I'm especially looking forward to eventually catching up and getting to do some of the high end rating content. I kind of expect that I probably won't be that attached to the game at max level. I feel like, or sorry, not necessarily max level, but I guess max level. After I've done all of the main story quests, I don't feel like I'm gonna be the sort of person who's like, oh, I got to go get glamours, I got to go mount farm, all these things that people seem to like. I don't think I'm gonna get into professions these just aren't things that super appeal to me. And maybe I'm wrong. Maybe I will get into them because in Final Fantasy 15, honestly, I got into like every aspect of the game. So I wouldn't be surprised if 14 winds up being the same way. But right now, I'm expecting I'm going to complete the story, and then I'm going to want to do some of the raids. I'm probably going to have a lot of fun with that. But then, based on the fact that there's no lockouts, I feel like I am going to get tired of it. But I think that's okay. And it seems like one of the things that people really like about 14 is that it doesn't really force you to do things in a way that WoW Retail did for a really long time. Because, like Burning Crusade Classic, for example, I've been raid logging for the past month, and I still love the game. And it's fine. I don't mind only playing a couple times a week. But retail WoW, for a long time, that is not something that it's permitted. There's always something else you have to be doing to keep your character up to date. And it seems like 14 is very much against that, which I think is very cool. But I also think that it might not grip me in the same way that Classic does. So we'll see. I'm definitely looking forward to the rest, and I'll see where it takes me.